is Promoting Democracy, or the Promotion of Democracy in the 21st Century, an Essential Tool Against Terrorism. One of the most interesting, I think, of possible titles. In many ways, it appears to be very much at the heart of the Bush administration foreign policy. It is a set of themes, one of which is old by contemporary standards. We've been debating the question of the promotion of democracy for a little over a decade in the public area. Democratic enlargement, of course, was the strategic theme of the early Clinton years, Anthony Lake being its major architect. And terrorism, of course, has just leaped to being the #1 issue on the minds of most people in the last couple of years. Our guest is just absolutely admirably prepared to talk about this very challenging and I think multifaceted theme. Prepared, I think, by heritage in many ways, certainly by formal education, by her practical experience and the things that she's been thinking about, as well as by the position which she holds currently. As Under-Secretary of State for Global Affairs, her responsibilities are numerous. She's responsible for democracy and human rights, and for labor, and for refugees, and humanitarian relief, and for the environment and scientific matters. I alert you for all the possible questions you could ask, but our focus tonight is on democracy and the promotion of it and its relationship to terrorism. Dr. Dobriansky is a graduate of Georgetown School of Foreign Service, her bachelor's degree in Foreign Service, Phi Beta Kappa. Her master's and PhD degrees are from Harvard in Soviet political and military studies. She has served in the State Department. She was an Assistant Secretary of State for Humanitarian Affairs at State. She was Director of the Office of Soviet and European Affairs at the National Security Council, and she's worked with the U.S. Information Agency there as an Associate Director for Programming and Policy. She's been in the private area, working with one of Washington's larger law firms as a senior advisor on international affairs and trade. And most recently, before assuming her current position, she was a senior vice president and in charge of the Washington office of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's had numerous honors which have followed her every step of her career. She has an honor, one of the highest merit honor awards from the Department of State. She has the Georgetown Alumni Achievement Award. She has Poland's highest Order of Merit. There are several others, and she's been awarded 2 honorary degrees. She's been a member of the board of many of the nation's most interesting organizations, all of which are recognizable to you, including the National Endowment for Democracy and Freedom House and others. Her publications are several. They've covered a variety of topics which follow her career. There's been work on politics of Eastern Europe, public diplomacy, and the strategies for promoting democracy, which is our topic for tonight. I think it's, and this is an abbreviated statement of her resume, which is one of the more impressive and interesting ones that I've noted. So as I said, she, I believe, is prepared by background, by formal education, by her experience in her current position to address this topic, I believe, with a great deal of interest for us. It's my great pleasure to present Dr. Paula Dobriansky.
Good evening to all of you, and I'd like to first say thank you, Frank, for that very warm introduction. I'm truly delighted to be here this evening at the Baltimore World Affairs Council, and especially to be talking about this topic. You're quite right in saying it is a topic that, well, our country has in fact debated over time and in different circumstances, even starting with the Founding Fathers. But especially, I think it's very timely to talk about the advancement of democracy and its role in the war on terror. Over the past 2.5 years, the war has been fought on many fronts and in many ways. And this is a war that will not be won on the field of battle alone. While at times we are left with no choice but to defend American interests with the force of arms, this is our last resort. America always seeks other ways to provide for our safety and that of our allies, just as we prefer to forestall threats before they become an immediate danger. It is our belief that the spread of liberal democracy is an essential part of a long-term strategy for preventing danger to America and our friends from materializing. Promoting democracy is a key component of the national security strategy that was initially released in September of 2002. And this document, which outlines the administration's overall plan for defending the United States and advancing its interests and its values, declared, quote, that America must stand firmly for the non-negotiable demands of human dignity, the rule of law, limits on the absolute power of the state, free speech, freedom of worship, equal justice, respect for women, religious and ethnic tolerance, and respect for private property, unquote. It noted further that, quote, we will work actively to bring the hope of democracy, development, free markets, and free trade to every corner of the world, unquote. President Bush is committed to these objectives, not only because they are right, but also because they are essential to winning the war on terror. In his speech at Whitehall Palace in London last November, the president said that, quote, we cannot rely exclusively on military power to assure our long-term security. Lasting peace is gained as justice and democracy advance. In democratic and successful societies, men and women do not swear allegiance to malcontents and murderers. They turn their hearts and labor to building better lives. And democratic governments do not shelter terrorist camps or attack their peaceful neighbors. They honor the aspirations and dignity of their own people. In our conflict with terror and tyranny, we have an unmatched advantage, a power that cannot be resisted, and that is the appeal of freedom to all mankind, unquote. But promoting democracy does not mean imposing the American model on other countries. On the contrary, democratic reforms inherently demand that citizens in emerging democracies must be free to develop institutions compatible with their own cultures and experiences. Democratic aspirations and rights are universal. They belong to all mankind. But the specific institutional forms and expressions of democracy will naturally vary by country. So what is essential is that democratically elected leaders are accountable to their fellow citizens. Non-elected leaders are at best detached and unaccountable, and at worst, isolated and tyrannical. More broadly, those outside their inner circles have limited influence on policy, and in many cases cannot even express their views without fear of persecution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to peaceably assemble serve to empower citizens, legitimize debate, and provide alternatives to violence. The fair and independent judicial systems present in liberal democracies play a similar role. A truly independent judiciary is a vital check on executive power and a protector of those exercising their rights to free expression. Ensuring that no group is above the law also gives average citizens a greater stake in their political systems. Well, absent these democratic attributes, we find conditions that in some instances give rise to sympathy for terrorism. This is especially true in nations where demagogues who preach the language of hate under the guise of religion are the only alternatives to a corrupt or brutal elite. Today, the danger to America comes not exclusively from dictators who make war directly upon us, our allies and our interests. It also emanates from those dictators who create an atmosphere so poisonous and so brutal that evil sprouts and motivates a small but radicalized cadre to terrorism. The United States is committed to supporting democracy in every country on every continent. This begins with our efforts in Afghanistan and in Iraq. In those two nations, we have demonstrated our resolve, first in subduing an immediate threat, then in staying the course to help establish a free and lasting peace. This resolve has had numerous benefits beyond the initial military victory. It has lent credibility to our diplomacy by showing that the United States is committed for the long haul. It has also enabled us to take a new look at old policies and to seek accelerated democratic reform in the region. In his speech to the British Parliament, President Bush noted, quote, "We must shake off decades of failed policy in the Middle East. Your nation and mine in the past have been willing to make a bargain, to tolerate oppression for the sake of stability. Long-standing ties led us to overlook the faults of local elites. Yet this bargain did not bring stability or make us safe. It merely brought time, while problems festered and ideologies of violence took hold," unquote. The change of the status quo in the Middle East and the prospect of a free and vibrant Iraq offer an enormous opportunity for democracy in the region, which will also set an example for the whole world. This is an opportunity to help millions of people, and while doing so, undermine the terrorists and enhance our security. In addition to our efforts on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are engaged in promoting democracy at the global level through such initiatives as what is known as the Community of Democracies. The Community is a new international network in which young and old democracies of different size and form gather to strengthen representative government, to share experiences with one another, to help one another, and to coordinate policies in the areas of common interest. Well over 100 free nations have come together, first in Warsaw in June of 2000, and then again in Seoul in November of 2002, to reaffirm their commitment to consolidating their own democratic institutions and working with other countries to help them along the path of democratization. The next gathering of the Community of Democracies will take place in 2005 in Chile. The goal of the community is to achieve practical results that directly benefit democracies and to refocus other international organizations on the ideals of liberty and self-determined government, which are frequently espoused but less frequently attained. Now, despite its youth, the Community of Democracies has achieved promising results. In the Seoul meeting, we discussed threats to democracy, which range from terrorism to coups. Because of the security issues facing open societies are different from those of non-democracies, this was a useful discussion among free nations adjusting their security postures to handle new dangers. At the conclusion of the meeting in Seoul, the community issued a plan of action, vowing to bolster democracy within their own borders and to support other governments in their commitment to democracy. This plan of action focused specifically on a number of areas. strengthening democratic assistance, strengthening civil society, strengthening regional cooperation, promoting education for democracy, and also bolstering the spirit of voluntarism. These were some of the areas actually identified in the Seoul Plan of Action. Now, the community is also assisting individual governments like East Timor, one of the world's newest democracies. Specifically, the Community of Democracies is preparing to send a multinational delegation to East Timor to share their experiences on those areas that East Timor would like advice on, specifically police training, rule of law, and political party development. Many nations in the community have also joined in seeking a democracy caucus at the United Nations. We are committed to helping reform the UN, and we believe a caucus of free nations with representative governments will advance this goal. It could also help to refocus the organization on the all too neglected principles of its founding charter. A democracy caucus is also critical to generating credibility for the UN Commission on Human Rights, a forum that has been populated by too many non-democratic states, like last year's chair, Libya, whose participation and others that are comparable have really mocked and taken down the very purpose of the organization. America's also enlisting the creativity and flexibility of the non-governmental sector to help advance our goals. The National Endowment for Democracy, of which I was affiliated with, or NED as it is called. It's a private nonprofit organization supported by the US government. It's an excellent example. NED has worked for over 20 years to strengthen democratic institutions through its multiple components. The American Center for International Labor Solidarity, the Center for International Private Enterprise, the International Republican Institute, and the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, as well as direct grants to non-governmental organizations. In his State of the Union address, President Bush announced that he will seek from Congress a doubling of the endowment's annual budget through the appropriation of an additional $40 million to be used for programs supporting democracy in the Middle East. Organizations like Freedom House also play an invaluable role in promoting democracy and holding non-democratic countries accountable for their actions. Others, such as the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, focus on elections and civil societies, and there are many more. We have redesigned our foreign aid to reward the countries that work the hardest for the interests of their people. The Millennium Challenge account, as this initiative is called, breaks with past development assistance programs by providing increased assistance to countries that are committed to governing justly, investing their own resources in their people, like for education, for health, and working to provide a proper climate for economic growth. This proposal implements the President's commitment to increase core development assistance by 50% over the next 3 years, thus adding $5 billion to the $10 billion now spent on these programs by fiscal year 2006. The Millennium Challenge account will help these nations spark what economists refer to as a virtuous cycle, in which improved governance and adherence to the rule of law leads to an increased capital flows from the private sector, which in turn will lead to economic growth and stability. We have also reinvigorated our efforts at disseminating information about America and about the universal values of democracy and freedom. Dictators and terrorists have no greater enemy than the truth. And as we did during the Cold War, we are striving to provide those who lack access to a free press with information that can empower them and steel them in their own determination to make liberal democracy a reality in their own countries. President Bush recently spoke of the need to, quote, cut through the barriers of hateful propaganda, unquote, that are found in parts of the world, and especially as we have seen in the Middle East. We are doing this by expanding the programming of Voice of America and other broadcast services, including a new Arabic television service. We seek to ensure these tools have the resources they need and are focused on the critical tasks of changing minds and explaining policies. To counter terrorism, we seek genuine representative government that brings liberty and democracy to all of a country's citizens, including those who have been often excluded, women. Women have a critical role to play in democracy, in civil society, and in ensuring that democratic ideals are instilled in future generations. As Queen Rania of Jordan recently stated, she said, quote, "Development will not achieve its goals unless women participate in it as complete and effective partners in all fields. We are in this together. We all share in a common future," unquote. We have pushed governments to extend to women the prerogatives that are their birthright, and we commend nations that have made strides in achieving this equality. One such nation is Morocco, which recently did away with the system that made women legally inferior to men. We are encouraging other nations in that region and elsewhere to follow suit through programs like the Middle East Partnership Initiative, which is reaching out to talented women in the Middle East and encouraging them through education and training to take their rightful places in their societies. The battles waged so far in the war on terror have involved coalitions of the willing that vary with the individual mission. And I am often asked if our engagement of non-democratic nations in our campaign against terrorists has sidelined U.S. efforts to promote democracy in those nations. The implication is that we cannot ask countries for help at the same time we are applying pressure for change. The reality, I think, is counterintuitive. In some instances, the war on terror has given us increased access to nations with which we previously had very limited interaction. By engaging these countries, by forging ties, and by finding areas to work together, we have gained influence and leverage. We have explained to them that a society that protects the freedoms of all citizens, pursues a rule of law, and provides citizens the right to have a say in their future is a more secure society. We have made clear that fighting terrorism and promoting freedom are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are one and the same. While we would like to see more rapid change in many instances, we believe that we are making more progress than we were before we asked for these nations' assistance. We also make it clear that our ultimate desire is to see freedom and democracy flourish in all nations. Every day a country deprives its people of these rights, it falls further behind the free world in development and runs the risk of catastrophic instability. The 2002 Arab Human Development Report, which was done under the auspices of the UNDP, which links low standards of living to the absence of democracy in the Arab world, makes this case starkly. This administration will always speak up for those who strive for democracy. Speaking about the heroic democratic dissidents of the 20th century, President Bush said, quote, "They knew of at least one place, a bright and hopeful land, where freedom was valued and secure, and they prayed that America would not forget them or forget the mission to promote liberty around the world," unquote. We will not forget, and there should be no doubt that we will stand with those who yearn for liberty, from Damascus to Tehran, from Rangoon to Harare, from Pyongyang to Havana, and in all places where freedom and representative government are not the norm. The United States will conduct the war on terror on many fronts with various tools. Our long-term strategy is to strike at the heart of terrorism by depriving it of its havens, its recruitment grounds, and its foot soldiers. We will do this in no small measure through the avid promotion of democracy and freedom. Last month, President Bush made our intentions, I think, quite clear. He said, quote, "America is a nation with a mission, and that mission comes with our most basic beliefs. We have no desire to dominate, no ambitions of empire. Our aim is a democratic peace, a peace founded upon the dignity and rights of every man and woman. America acts in this cause with friends and allies at our side, yet we understand our special calling. This great republic will lead the cause of freedom," unquote. Thank you very much, and I look very much to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question was, should others be more vigorous in sharing the role with the United States, the role in promoting democracy?
I think absolutely yes. And in fact, if I did not convey that to you, let me underscore that point. That was very much the essence of my comments. I think the United States has a leadership role. I think we have an experience to share. We have our own experience to share. But at the same time, this cannot be done alone. It has to be done, in fact, with many allies, with friends, with emerging democracies, with others. One of the activities that I personally have been very engaged in, and have to say that I think that this entity has significant potential for having an impact, and that is what I described to you as the community of democracies. The community of democracies, as I mentioned, was born in Warsaw. Its first meeting took place in Warsaw in June of 2000. In that meeting, the first essential step was really to bring countries together to embrace common democratic principles. In the Seoul meeting in 2002, there was an agreement that all the countries that are democratic must come together to work individually, to work regionally, to work globally in encouraging the spread of democracy. I have to say, in our work with the Chilean chair, we've been very gratified. They have put forward a number of initiatives, like the one I mentioned on East Timor, in which you have a group of multinational countries. The United States, Portugal is looking at being involved in this, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, as well as Chile, and there are several others, will come together and they will share with the East Timor government their own respective experiences about police training, about political party development. In each of these countries, it's different. But the value of it will be that the East Timorese government will have the benefit of hearing a number of different presentations. The message is still the same, and the message is the promotion of democracy is essential. And let me give one last example, if I may. We, after the Seoul meeting, we had proposed the notion of bringing together countries, democratic countries from Latin America, to sit down with countries from Africa. And the reason is because in Africa, a number of the countries have been grappling with the change from the OAU to the AU, and then there's also now the rise of a new organization, which is a new economic partnership that exists in Africa. And they were looking for opportunities to get some advice about regional cooperation. So what we did, we had 7 African countries sit down with 7 Latin countries. We were only the facilitators of this. And you had the Latin NGOs with Latin officials literally talking about their experiences. And the topics were really, I think, very essential. There were the discussion about poverty and poverty eradication and how democracy empowers individuals. And each individual has a role that he or she can play in society and can affect and change a society. The point just is, I'm giving you examples. Your message and your question, I think, goes to the heart of this. It is essential that many and all participate in this. That is certainly our goal. That's certainly our objective here.
Could you spell out what's going on in several of the countries, Afghanistan and Iraq in particular, with respect to the enhancement of the role of women in societies which previously don't have much of a tradition of that participation?
Thank you for that question. Women have a vital role to play in a democracy. And you can't really have a democracy if you only have half of your population participating. What is striking is not only did Queen Rania make this statement, but I was actually looking, I brought it, I thought I had brought it with me. Actually, the King of Morocco also made this statement recently in a speech to the Moroccan parliament. In Afghanistan, the issue was a very important one which we conveyed our views that we felt it was important to have all members of society participate. If you're going to have a participatory democracy, then you do have to have the participation of all. I think that recently the Loya Jirga that took place in Afghanistan, just starting with that example, that I think that you have quite strikingly the fact that you had a lot of women who did in fact participate. That's not to say that there weren't differences that came out in those discussions, but also if some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware, they came forward with a consensus on their constitution. What they opted for in their constitution is to actually if you will, reserve spots in the parliament, in the upper house and the lower house for women. The lower house is particularly crucial because those positions are elected directly from the population. And it ends up being some 25% of the positions are allocated to women. The upper house is selected by the president of Afghanistan. And in that particular case, also, there's a percentage that's attached to it. That's what the Afghans decided. They decided that they wanted to take that particular course of action. A number of other countries in the region, Pakistan, for example, also has followed that comparable approach in terms of specific involvement of women in parliament. But I think quite significantly, as our ambassador to Afghanistan said, that that constitution that came forward in Afghanistan is really one of the most enlightened constitutions in the Islamic world. In Iraq, we are involved in developments in Iraq, and I will say to you that, in our opinion, there's more that needs to be done. You're quite right in saying women, there were only 3 who were appointed to the governing council and 1 who lost her life in holding that position. It's essential that women be integrated at all political positions in the political decision-making process, whether it is as Iraq moves forward, what kind of entity is established. And for that matter, in terms of the ministries, women need to be involved. There is one woman who is the head of the Ministry of Public Works. We would like to see, in fact, more women integrated into the ministries. I think the bottom line here is that it's essential to really get this message out. And this message, I think, has got to be gotten out, not only at governmental levels, but at all levels. And this is an area that we are very much committed to. I wanted this very much to be part of my remarks because it is very much part of our policy. I think Afghanistan has been moving in a very positive direction, and I think there have been a number of steps there that have been taken for the positive. I think in the Middle East at large, because I didn't address that, at large we have seen some significant changes in certain areas. For example, in Oman, the vote has been extended there to all adult citizens. Bahrain last year, citizens elected their own parliament. There have been a number of changes that we have witnessed. We should try to encourage those changes to go forward. Change from within is always the best kind of change, but we need to encourage it. Finally, in Iraq, as I said, we have seen some levels in which women have been engaged. Women are very engaged at the local level and also in many NGOs, but we want to see more women at the top decision-making positions.
Does Pakistan jar the model that you described?
Okay. No, I don't think so, because in my remarks, that's why I mentioned, I do get often asked the question about the war on terrorism, and then at the same time, the coalition countries, the range of countries that we have dealt with. It's interesting you mentioned Pakistan. I'll share with you a country that's usually raised with me, has been Uzbekistan, actually. I will say to you, as I have said, what it does afford us is an opportunity to discuss issues that were not necessarily, in which there was not necessarily an opportunity to discuss human rights issues, democracy-related issues as openly and as directly before. But I would not stand here and say to you that by having been afforded that opportunity, would I say that in these cases, and even some other cases, that has directly related to a complete change or a complete redirection. No, but I think it has had an impact in these various countries in terms of decisions that they have been making with regard to democracy, with regard to human rights practices. In terms of the cases, I'm actually more familiar with Uzbekistan. And I know that in Uzbekistan, there have been many human rights organizations that have come to us about issues that have been of concern, whether it be freedom of religion, freedom of the press. Well, recently there was an independent and free press. Actually, they had a ceremony that was actually set up in Uzbekistan. It's incremental, it's an incremental change, but the point is, in some of these cases, with some countries, there hasn't been that kind of opportunity to have influence. And interestingly enough, this engagement has afforded us that. I'm not saying it's a panacea. It isn't. But it is an opportunity to try to bring about change, and I think we have been witnessing that.
How would you compare the argument that a very practical, huge political circumstance viewed through the eyes of realpolitik, the Arab-Israeli conflict, is central to the phenomenon of terrorism, as opposed to the picture you presented, the absence of democracy creating turmoil? How would you compare those two?
Let me divide this up in two contexts. First, I am a strong believer personally, and I'm part of this administration, but personally, as you mentioned, when I was out of government, for years I have been very much involved with the whole issue of democracy promotion. I am a very strong believer that democracy is the best antidote to countering terrorism. Those countries that are democratic are those countries that are at peace. I went through in the beginning of my remarks recounting some of the very basic fundamentals of a democratic society. Why does that matter? It matters greatly because the fundamentals that we have and that other countries have that may be of a different variety, but the concept is the same. It allows for freedom of speech. It allows for a process that one goes through when you feel that you have been wronged. We have various mechanisms and avenues for ventilating, if you will. But most significantly, if you don't like something, you have ways and means of letting it be known, but not resorting to violence, not resorting to taking the life of another. As I say that, meaning if you do, then we have, of course, mechanisms and ways of dealing with it. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but I think it is the best that we have in dealing with what is truly a challenge. Now, having said that, in mentioning the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's interesting because that component comes up, but not the way that you've juxtaposed it. Some will say that, well, we don't see democratic change coming to the Middle East unless that is resolved. I will come back to the premise. I do think that the situation there is a crucial one. But if you go to what this administration has espoused, it comes back to democracy. We would like to see a democratic Palestinian state. We would like to see changes made that really would, in fact, benefit those not only just in the Arab-Israeli, you know, in that limited context, but more broadly. I think it comes back very fundamentally to democracy. So, in sum, yes, I am of the opinion that really it is a democratic framework that has the greatest promise. When you look at those countries, and I'll give you an example, to come back to the first question that was asked of me about, you know, dealing with other countries. I was very struck when we held at the under the Community of Democracies, this gathering between the Latin countries and the African countries. President Flores of El Salvador was there, and he mentioned about the conflict in their country and what was at one time tremendous polarization. He talked about the hardships, he talked about the human rights abuses, but then he talked about the fact that every country has wealth. The wealth is in its individual. And if individuals are given the opportunities to develop themselves, to express themselves through democracies and a democratic foundation, that, you know, that will inspire and bring about stability, it brings about economic growth, and it also brings about strong alliances. I think that is the best course of action. That approach is very much linked to the approach that we have in dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and specifically calling for a democratic Palestinian state.
What happens when democracy has untoward consequences?
We have witnessed that already in a number of cases, in a number of examples, and that have already happened heretofore. The bottom line is that elections, 2 points. First of all, elections are not only a democracy make. You can have an election, but an election may not result in a democracy. It's only one component. You have to have a vibrant civil society. You also have to have a rule of law, a system that is free from corruption, an ability to enable your citizens to be able to speak, to respect different religions, to be able to worship, to assemble. So you can have an election, but the issue is, what is the elected outcome? Is the elected outcome actually a democratic one? Is it one that is actually going to ultimately harm its citizens? And also, has the election been conducted freely or fairly? All of these issues have to be taken into account. I don't think that we would determine here in terms of quote-unquote outcomes, but where you cross a line is where there are what I would say undemocratic outcomes that really affect the lives of not only those in a country, but the lives of those in surrounding countries. That's what the fundamental issue is.
Can you put a price tag on the promotion of democracy, and where did the funds go?
I honestly don't have a figure off the top of my head, but I will tell you this. You asked where the funds go. The funds go through 3 channels. I'd put it this way. First is we give resources to non-governmental organizations. I mentioned the role that they play. I cited only a few. There are many, many more. And when I speak of NGOs, I don't only speak of American NGOs, because some of the groups that I've mentioned, like the National Endowment for Democracy, they get monies governmentally. They had 30 million. It's been up to an additional 40 million for the Middle East. Their monies go to support indigenous NGOs on the ground. So support for NGOs is absolutely essential. Not just ours, but specifically those that are on the ground, because those organizations on the ground are the ones who know it best. They know what they need in terms of promoting free speech, of bolstering civil society in a particular country. Secondly, we also work with other countries. I mentioned the issue of the Millennium Challenge account. Here, this is tying foreign aid to the issue of governing, good governance, investing in people, and also economic reforms. So there's actually a linkage there. There's an incentive that any foreign assistance that goes abroad goes to help those countries that have an infrastructure, where you know that actually these monies will go and will be used to a desired effect, that they do not fall in hands that will not benefit society at large, or they are taken for or fall into corrupt hands. Let me put it that way. Thirdly, I would say that our resources have gone to also support a number of multinational efforts. I've mentioned the Community of Democracies. We are participants in the UN Human Rights Commission. That's a component. There's an interrelationship here. There are other institutions like that.
The question is, what is your strategy or approach to unelected governments where they may exist? Hereditary monarchies, more specifically.
The extent to which we have addressed this has been in the context of the human rights reports, in stating the actual form of various governments. We have not taken positions with regard to this specifically. You have a number of monarchies, some that are hereditary, some that are not. In this regard, what I can say is that I think most significantly is that you have seen that representatives of those various monarchies have been engaged in these debates and discussions themselves. I also mentioned that I think it's important that there is change from within. You know, it's one of the most difficult things. We can have goals and objectives, but it's very difficult to, you know, force change and bring about change from out in. There has to be part of this coming from within. And that's why, hence your question, we do support a lot of organizations that are inside various countries and supporting the work that they're doing. They have the best sense and pulse of what are the types of measures that can actually be brought about. Those are also the changes that I think are the most long-lasting.
So we can expect to see ferment in the kingdom of Morocco, Saudi Arabia, the Sheikh, the Emperor of Japan, perhaps even in the United States?
I think we have already seen. As I said, the King of Morocco, you know, it's very striking in terms of the statements that he himself has made. He's been the one, if you follow this, has been in the lead. He was the one who came out and made the statement with regard to women in Morocco being full representatives and being full participants in society and in decisions being made. And then also recently the change in the family law that just took place in Morocco, which is very significant, was something that he also came forward and had referenced. I think it's very striking the kinds of changes, statements that we are seeing made across the board, and not only, you know, in the area that you're speaking of.
How important is it that this policy be successful in countries such as Russia, and to what extent has it been successful?
I think it's very important to see success in this area in all countries that we're grappling with. My own background, I deal and have dealt mostly with Central Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And I will tell you that just starting with Eastern Europe, I think, and I have felt, and others have felt who are dealing with these areas and issues, how important it is to really provide the kind of impetus to move these countries forward in their democratic path. And I think we have witnessed, I mean, really a tremendous success looking at Poland, looking at Hungary, looking at what we've seen evolve in Romania, in the Czech Republic, many of these countries. That's not to say they don't have a ways to go. They themselves will say that in terms of discussing their own situation and in certain areas that they want to see furthered. In the case of Russia, I think there have been some significant steps forward in terms of Russia's democratic path, At the same time, there are a number of areas that have been of concern. Secretary Powell made a trip recently. He went to the new Georgian president's inauguration, and then he made a visit to Moscow. And during his visit to Moscow, he spoke quite candidly about about a number of human rights issues and referenced this in his remarks. In particular, free speech is one of the areas. Free speech in the sense, free press has been a concern, and the way in which those independent press entities have actually been handled. That's just one example. Another is the issue of corruption and the great concern about a lack of an infrastructure to deal and to grapple with corruption in Russia. But no, we still have to see change and improvement.
Do American trade barriers get in the way of the promotion of democracy and free markets as you see it?
First, I'd start with the issue we have been really trying to work through the various rounds. Our trade representative, Robert Zellick, has really strived to grapple with these issues and to try to find a more equitable base. I was involved with our effort in Johannesburg, the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And why I'm raising this, and then I'll make the link to democracy, is because we do see trade as an important engine of growth and an important engine of development. So those discussions are important. They are key. He's very committed in trying to find, as I said, common ground. Some areas are difficult and have been difficult. Having said that, there are other ways and means of also providing assistance. I've mentioned in terms of the announcement of the Millennium Challenge account, particularly to a number of countries in which it's not only just trade, but it actually is an infusion of assistance that could be targeted and well used on the ground, that such resources could really have an important impact. But the link to democracy there is you can't have that impact really if the monies are not well used. In evaluating how monies and development assistance have been used over time, you want to make sure that resources go to the desired target and do not fall into corrupt hands or are not wasted. So there are linkages there. It is essential to find some of the most liberalized avenues, and he has been trying to find those.
How much support, or what is the American position with respect to the discontented reformists in Iran?
We have been first very broadly concerned about the fact that in Iran you have a groundswell, not only in this case, but even we've seen several months ago, a groundswell of activity, an outpouring for change, an outpouring to see liberties and freedom brought about. There have been a number of demonstrations, and some of the groups demonstrating have been more specific about their desires than others. I think that the manifestation recently by the legislators also underscores that there really is a movement for change that is occurring within Iran. And in terms of supporting those kinds of movements, we support those because we want to see people to be able to come forward, to express themselves, to be able to come forward and not only to express themselves, but to do so without fear of persecution, a fear of any reprisal. That's the kind of position that we have here.
The first question is, does stability in a situation like Iraq demand overwhelming force for a successful occupation? And your implication was for successful change of regime as well. And then secondly, you refer to a variety of terrible practices with respect to women. And your question was, does the administration know anything about these two things?
First, with regard to troops, I'm certainly not going to second-guess the Pentagon in this case. This is not my portfolio. You're asking me, you said General Myers is coming. I think you should be there. You should ask him that question.
Not in quite the same way, perhaps.
But, you know, it's been an issue that's been addressed, and from what I hear in the Pentagon and the daily briefings and the Secretary of Defense, I mean, and our military leaders on the ground, that's what they have indicated. With regard to the other, in terms of women and human rights abuses, I'll put it more generally. In terms of human rights abuses, well, we issue annual human rights reports. And these annual human rights reports do document quite specifically the kinds of practices that, on a country-by-country basis, that have been waged against women. In this case, in terms of forced abortions, in terms of the issue of genital mutilation you mentioned. I mean, you also just picked out one area. Let me just say this. It's an area that is looked at across the board in terms of literally physical harm and rights deprived to women. These are issues that we speak out against, but there needs to be even more of an outcry. I'll mention one area and one issue that's relatively new at the State Department, and maybe you have read a bit about, and that is the issue of human trafficking, which is literally a modern-day form of slavery. This affects predominantly women, young women, and also children. And what it is you have young women, children, who are put into forced labor or forced prostitution, forced bondage, and literally are deprived absolutely any rights. I mean, these are not only outright human rights abuses, but outright crimes. In these cases, we are doing everything possible to not only devote resources in these areas, but also to speak out about these various areas.
Unfortunately, and I apologize to everybody who still has a question, and there are many of you, we do have to end our meeting now. That was a very clear overview, and I think the problems involved you've also made equally clear. Thank you for your thoroughness in answering questions.
Thank you.